Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and our conversations with the Harvard Classics. We are now into volume number 15, where at the first part of volume number 15, we'll be messing with Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. Now, John Bunyan has an interesting history, and we'll get to his biography in a little bit. But think about this for a moment, because we often have said this in Room 303. If it is the case, just consider for a moment. If it is the case that as an individual and as a group of individuals, we are the stories that we tell, the stories we retell, the stories we accept, the stories we reject. If all of that is true, and I think that it is, then it's probably the case that one of the most important story motifs for us is the journey motif. That is to say, the notion of our lives are best understood as a journey. And if you'll think about it, it's kind of an interesting distinction that we might draw between being a child and being an emerging adolescent and soon an adult, in that children most often, don't think of their lives as journeys. That, it seems to me, is a function of what happens as we get older, especially because of the titles that we learn to tell and retell. Think about it. We began, of course, with Homer's Odyssey, the classic text of journeys. In fact, Odysseus' name, it becomes the classic meaning of this notion of journey. As well, of course, Virgil's Aeneid. Think about St. Augustine's Confessions and all, if you will, biographies. To Carthage then I came, he says in his classic Confessions. His life is in many ways defined by the journeys of his life. Of course, Dante's Inferno, hello, what is Dante's Inferno if it is not, in fact, the story of the journey, right? And more particularly the Divine Comedy of Dante. And then we just finished with Cervantes' Don Quixote. Think about what that story is. Of course, it's satire. Of course, it's entertaining. But what is it also? Well, it's a story about a man who takes a journey. Several of them, as a matter of fact. And of course, through the process in that mock satiric epic, right? Cervantes is playing around with all of those ancient motifs of Homer. Then we meet this classic in the Harvard Classics now, this classic, Pilgrim's Progress. It's going to be, in many ways, the Protestant equivalent to Dante's Catholic rendition of the journey. And then even into the 20th and the 21st century, a number of you are very familiar with Paulo Coelho's The Alchemist, a text which plays the same kind of game. Think about it from this perspective. Journeys are fundamental to how we understand the religions on this planet. All three of the monotheisms, for example, are built around the notion of the journey, right? So, for example, you have the journeys of first Abraham and then later Moses, of course, in the Jewish tradition. Of course, in the Christian tradition, we will have those subsumed as well with the stories and the journeys of one Jesus Christ, and of course, St. Paul. Think of it. St. Paul, in fact, is going to be called to his mission work on a journey. Right? And then think about the other monotheism of Islam. Muhammad, of course, we define in Islam so much of the beginnings as the Hajj, the journey. And of course, in the Islamic faith, think about the power of the notion of the journey that is often taken by many believers within that faith tradition. Of course, as well, Hinduism and the Bhagavad Gita is all about journeys. Of course, Buddhism itself is as well understood in the form of journeys. This is to say, we now will see one more time the journey motif at play. Now, if you haven't been watching our stuff at learnstrong.net, I recommend you go there and take a look at our Harvard Classics previous lectures, lectures 1 through 74. This is lecture 75, so we've been talking for a while in the Harvard Classics. Remember our learning theory as well, right? That notion of we define learning as that capacity to create and connect and relate new information to old information in meaningful ways. Our 3 levels of reading, our annotative work is always crucial. We always remind ourselves of these objectives as we begin. At level 1, read what does the text say. At level 2, read what does the text mean. At 2A, themes, messages. At 2B, the rhetorical reading of the text. Here we're going to concentrate on symbolism and allegory because Bunyan specifically wrote this text as an allegory, and obviously we're going to have to talk about Plato's Republic in Book 7 of the Cave Allegory and all of that. Finally, at level 3, we ask, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? At 3A, can I relate it to other texts that I know of? And, well, actually, this won't shock you because in 303, we always seem to want to come back to the great American poet Walt Whitman, but we'll play games at the very end of our lecture where Whitman in many ways subsumes a whole lot of this understanding of the epic, of the journey motif. What other kinds of journey motifs are we familiar with at 3A? And then finally we'll ask the 3B question, and I'm setting you up for it, so I want you to think about it in some way. In what ways are you as an adolescent already beginning to define your life as the journey? I mean, think about how important it is in the 20th century that for so long the patriarchy had taught only adult males define themselves with the journey. I mean, think about it, right? So Odysseus goes on his journey, and there's Penelope sitting, waiting at home, right? Unweaving the weaving that she's done earlier in the day. But fundamentally, the Greeks, the Romans, they understand this journey motif as the way that males define their life, of course. And other people are not so easily allowed within the patriarchal understanding, right? And yet in the 20th century, we begin to kind of challenge that idea, right? So, for example, we have this notion that all of a sudden, wait a minute, what about people of color? Can't they have also a journey? We study, for example, the great texts like Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery, or the great autobiography of Frederick Douglass, and all of a sudden we begin to get this sense, but wait a minute, what about women? I mean, aren't they allowed? And all of a sudden, with the importance of the feminist tradition, we talk about yellow wallpaper, and go back and take a look at that lecture. Notice at the very end, right? Now, why should that man have fainted? But he did, and right across my path, so I had to creep over him every time. And we talk at the end of that lecture about how significant a moment that is. The works of Audre Lorde, the works of Tilly Olson, the works of Alice Walker, and on it goes. I mean, the power of the idea that if men can define their life through a journey, so can women. Why not? But then in the 20th century as well, with classics like Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, we think about the significance of James Joyce's portrait of the artist as a young man. The adolescent begins to define his or her life as well through the understanding of the journey. So we'll ask that question in 3B. All right, before we jump into the text itself, and we will follow very similarly the ways that we have been messing around with all the other Harvard Classics lectures, we'll begin with a brief bit of biography here. Very interesting life. Born in 1628. Think about that. That's 28 years after Shakespeare's Hamlet is performed on stage for the first time in 1600. And it's 40 years before Milton's in Paradise Lost. So it kind of gives you a sense of the window of time. He is English, born in Bedford. He spends a brief time in the army. He picks up a trade as what we call a tinker, that is to say fixing pots and pans. And after a marriage, he becomes in many ways a theological and religious nonconformist. That is to say, he's part of that evangelical, soon to be understood that way, evangelical Christian tradition. He spends quite a bit of time, 12 years in prison, and that's where he actually begins his work of Pilgrim's Progress and dies at the age of 59 in 1688. He wrote nearly 60 titles, but this is the one that for which he's most importantly remembered. Let's talk about Pilgrim's Progress for just a bit. One of the most published books, and this surprises a lot of my students when I say this, one of the most published books in all of the history of English, no doubt. It's understood, obviously, as a theological text. I mean, go back to our comments on Brown's Religio Medici. We can treat this text as a theological and religious text, no doubt, but we will be spending more time looking at it as a literary text. Never out of print. Isn't that amazing? Translated into over 200 languages. Published, as we said, in 1678, 6 years after the release from prison. It is he called it, spiritual religious allegory, a story with, in other words, second and tertiary third level meanings. The 108,260 words divided into two parts. Part 1 published in 1678, as we said. Part 2 published in 1684. Now, Part 2 is not as well known, and yet we're going to argue just as important. Again, he saw it as an allegory, a story with these archetypal characters and situations, kind of like you might think about the parables of Christ or Gautama Buddha or any number of other important teachers. But most importantly, in the literary tradition, we think, of course, of Plato. And, of course, Republic 7 is the classic allegory, the cave allegory, as we reference it. Go back and take a look at those lectures. It's also understood as a dream sequence, kind of like Dante's Journey in many ways. It's going to have the feel of Dante's Journey at times, where we're going to have this instructional thing happening, where we're going to have guides, very much like Virgil's role for Dante the Pilgrim. All of that's going to happen. Now, what specifically is the text about? Let's do a brief plot summary and then a more in-depth plot summary, and I'll even share some of my favorite maybe lines from Pilgrim's Progress. The name of our hero, we got to have a hero, right? The name of our hero is actually Christian. That's his name. But of course he will serve as the archetypical understanding for Bunyan of what this Christian practitioner will look like. He will leave the city of desolation or city of destruction, and he will come ultimately to the city of Zion. On his journey, he's going to meet people who are helpers, like evangelists, and he's going to meet people who are not so great helpers, distractors, we might say. Like, for example, the giant devil Apollyon, who will try to kill him. Christian will have to learn that he has to bypass certain kinds of distractions, or has to endure them. Like, for example, the famous city Vanity Fair, kind of like the Las Vegas, the distractions there. He passes through the Valley of Ease, the Valley of Conceit, and any number of other valleys, and all kinds of challenges. He crosses finally the River of Death, and there he makes it to heaven or to Zion. That's the end of part one. Part two will pick up on what really was one of the most controversial parts of part one, because at the very beginning of the, I'm going to sometimes call it a poem, sometimes call it a novel. It's difficult to know exactly what to call it. The allegory, at the very beginning of the allegory, he leaves his wife and children to go on this journey. And there's a whole lot of readers that said, wait a minute, how can this be understood as an important religious allegory when the hero, Christian, leaves his family and children to the city of destruction? And so in the second part, we have the second rendering, the second journey, the second Pilgrim's Progress, in the form of Christina, just Christian with an A at the end of it, and she will take her journey along with her children, and at the very end she will herself as well find her way into the famous city of Zion, that is to say heaven. Now, let's take a look at the first part. We're going to spend more time closely studying the first part, and it can be divided into different sections. We've got no line numbers here. And arbitrarily, in many ways, you can divide this thing up from anywhere from 10 sections to 20 sections. We're going to mess around with, we'll qualify it as 17 sections. So let's go through it quickly. We begin in section 1, the apology. Now here again, just to go back to our conversations with Harvard Classics and the Plato lectures, the word apology here doesn't mean I'm sorry, but rather let me tell you why I've got to do what I've got to do. That's what originally apology meant, a defense. Very much like Plato's apology. He says that he will write in allegory and he's going to publish as opposed to a sermon. That is to say, he says we are telling stories here. We are, in many ways, as we said, the stories we tell and the stories we accept and retell or reject. His book will make a traveler of anyone who follows it, Bunyan will say, and his book is at the same time entertainment and instructional. That is to say, both the head and the heart will be understood as somehow being elicited together. And again, it's going to be a dream and a den or a cave that he will open with, again, an allegory for the Christian life. The fact that he opens in a cave will be significant for us as Platonists and as Platonic readers. Let's just take a look now at a couple of lines here from the very beginning, and I just want to give you a sense of how he finishes this apology. He says, this book, the final lines of the apology, this book will make a traveler of thee, if by its counsel thou wilt ruled be. It will direct thee to the Holy Land, if thou wilt its directions understand. By the way, notice we have the same game that's going to be played by Alexander Pope. Think about Essay on Man. Presume not God to scan. The proper study of mankind is man. Those rhymed couplets. We're going to play the same game here. If thou wilt its direction understand, yea, it will make the slothful active be, the blind also delightful things to see. Now, Bunyan recognized that he was open to the fundamental question, wait a minute, why do you have to tell us what the Christian life is about if we have the New Testament? It's a fair question. Bunyan argues back that sometimes people forget. We're going to see this as one of the major mantras of Pilgrim's Progress, the only sin is to forget. That is to say, we have a tendency to forget things, and in the process of forgetting, we need to be reminded what better way to do it than with stories. Right? To continue, art thou for something rare and profitable? Wouldst thou see a truth within a fable? Art thou forgetful? Wouldst thou remember from New Year's Day to the last of December? Then read my fancies. They will stick like burrs and may be to the helpless comforters. This book is written in such a dialect as may the minds of listeners affect. It seems a novelty and yet contains nothing but sound and honest gospel strains. Much debate about that. By the way, when we study together, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, you can find that again at Learn Strong in the Junior folder. We made the same observation, that just because somebody writes in religious language doesn't mean that all of the religious people of that ilk are necessarily going to agree with it. And Pilgrim's Progress is in fact debated, was debated in its publishing, and continues to be debated. Nothing wouldst thou diverts from melancholy, wouldst thou be pleasant, yet be far from melancholy, wouldst thou from folly, wouldst thou read riddles and their explanation, or else be drowned in thy contemplation? Dost thou love picking meat? Or wouldst thou see a man in the clouds and hear him speak to thee? Wouldst thou be in a dream? We're going to hear a lot about dreaming, and yet not sleep. Or wouldst thou in a moment laugh and weep? Wouldst thou lose thyself and catch no harm, and find thyself again without a charm? Wouldst thou read thyself, and read thou knowest not what, yet know whether thou art blessed or not by reading the same lines? Oh, then come hither, and lay my book, thy head and heart together. So in other words, we messed around, you'll remember, with the opening lines of Paradise Lost, right? To justify the ways of God to men is the way that Milton said his theodictic enterprise, as we said, the explaining of why there's bad stuff in the world. We're going to get a theodicy. Let's put that in our notes. That's significant. We're going to get a theodicy here. That notion of why is there bad stuff that happens in the world? How come there's bad stuff that happens in the world? We're going to get that. And ultimately, we'll go ahead and give it away now. The idea will be it's a propedeutic. It's instructional. It's didactic. And we're going to get that level of instruction here. All right, let's go now quickly through the final sections of part 1 and then, of course, part 2. Section 2. We meet Christian. He's a poor man. He's got a heavy sack on his back, and he asks, what shall I do with this heavy backpack? He tells his wife and kids the city is to be destroyed. The town ridicules him. Think about that passage from Nietzsche's, the Nietzschean passage, Madman. Everyone makes fun of him. He asks, what shall I do to be saved? And in the process, he meets Evangelist. Evangelist tells him to follow the light, find a gate, knock for help. Christian will leave his family shouting, life, life, eternal life. Again, this leaving of the family we'll come back to in the second part. 2 men will meet him. Obstinate will laugh and leave. Pliable will follow with him. You'll notice how these names then are types of people. They come to the slough of despond, where Christian gets stuck. The weight on his back is too great. Pliable leaves and goes home. He's got no interest in the long, arduous journey, if you will. Mr. Worldly Wise tells him, lose the burden, stop with the serious questions, go to the village called Morality and Mount Zion, and Christian is afraid. Just a couple of lines from this section. The opening lines, because they give us a sense of kind of how this language works. As I walk through the wilderness of this world, think about the opening lines of Dante's Inferno in the middle of the way. I lighted in a certain place where it was a den. I laid me down in a place to sleep, and I slept and I dreamed a dream. So this idea of all of this is going to be subsumed as some kind of a dream. All right, let's keep going now into section 3 now. Christian will admit to the evangelist that he was led astray. Evangelist will say that world-wise man is only interested in this world and avoiding pain. And we have that moment that will resonate for us, just like in our study of Dante's Inferno, especially when Virgil will say to Dante, up on your feet, this is no time to tire. You'll remember that that's the way that it works. A couple of lines from this section that I'll share with you. Evangelist will say, stand a little, that I may show thee the words of God, he says. Now the just shall live by faith, and if any man draws back, my soul shall have no pleasure in him. He also did thus apply them. Thou art the man that art running into his misery. In other words, we choose our pain. He says, draw back thy foot from the way of peace. To choose to do that will cause you problems. Christian, we're told, falls down at his feet as a dead man, crying, woe is me, and all manner of sin and blasphemy shall be forgiven unto men. Evangelist will tell him. And in other words, this is one of those moments early on when we have this sense about, let me tell you why people struggle in this world. And then we're told there are 3 things in this man's counsel that thou must utterly abhor, the suggestions that were being made. His turning thee out of the way, his laboring to render the cross odious to thee, and his setting thy feet in that way that leadeth unto the administration of death. We're going to hear this a lot through the course of Pilgrim's Progress. Section 4, Christian arrives at the gate, goodwill is there. He says, keep carrying the weight for a while longer. You can obviously see the weight is symbolic, right? He comes to the house of the interpreter, which is going to show him 4 images. This will sound very much like Dante's Inferno. The first is a picture of a grave man, only living for the next life. The second is the picture of a man sweeping, kicking up dust. Here we're going to get this notion of the law is the problem. A girl sprinkling water to settle the dust will be the sweet grace of the gospel in paragraph 138. Number 3, we see 2 children, Passion, the oldest, Patience, the youngest. Passion can't wait, but Patience will wait. Those willing to wait and therefore be rewarded. And then the next one, 4, he sees the image of huge fire, and throwing water on it makes it worse. This is the fire is the work of grace, and of course we've got Satan throwing water on the grace. Image number 5, he sees a man fighting through armed men to get to salvation. He sees another one, a man in a cage. And he will say at paragraph 150, I am what I once was not. He was once a professor, that is to say he lived his faith, but now he's locked in despair, a hardened heart. And then he gets this image of a man getting out of bed, a dream within the dream, we might say. An image of Judgment Day. This is this apocalyptic vision. And he says where the wheat will be separated from the chaff. Some will be saved, the wheat, and others, the chaff, will be lost. Kristen says that he won't forget these word pictures, and Bunyan clearly, and I would put this in my notes at 2b, Bunyan clearly is working with powerful word pictures to try to suggest what? Well, namely, we have a tendency to forget what's most important in our lives, and these powerful images can kind of get us there. That is to say, we want to watch and we want to learn through the reading of this text. I can't overemphasize the significance of the way in which this kind of thing became very, very popular in England, and then of course in America, this literature. I mean, I'll just give you an example. Christian speaking with interpreters